This video describes how the establishment of a stroke recovery centre within the city of Boroondara can make a dramatic improvement in the provision of community-based support for stroke survivors and their carers, and serve as a model for the expansion of the stroke support network throughout Victoria and eventually throughout Australia. This vision of a stroke recovery centre crystallised from discussions amongst stroke survivors and carers who are members of the Boroondara Stroke Support Group, as well as John and Glenda Norton, who participated in the Boroondara Stroke Recovery Pathways Action Group. This first slide illustrates how the current system of post-clinical care or community care works in Boroondara and, for that matter, in most of Victoria. We start with the normal acute or subacute care system where stroke survivors and carers are discharged from hospital back into the community and into the care of their local GP, who may be or may not be knowledgeable and experienced enough to properly monitor their long stroke recovery journeys. We also have a number of stroke organisations, such as the National Stroke Foundation, the Stroke Association of Victoria, a local stroke support group, and a local community health centre. Also shown here is the Stroke Recovery Black Hole, which is a place where many stroke survivors and carers end up if they do not get appropriate community support. Here we see what may happen to stroke survivors and their carers following discharge from hospital. It is basically up to them to locate their own post-clinical or community support. Some may eventually find their way to the local community health centre. Others may find their way to the National Stroke Foundation, or the Stroke Association of Victoria, or a local stroke support group. But others will find it all just too hard and will effectively give up and fall into the stroke recovery black hole and a poor quality of life devoid of hope and happiness. A small percentage of the stroke survivors and carers will eventually find their way to the local stroke support group, where they can meet up with fellow stroke survivors and carers and start learning how others have tackled the problems they have faced along their own stroke recovery journeys. From the point of view of stroke survivors and their carers, this situation is entirely unsatisfactory. The complete lack of a coherent, systematic approach leaves so many stroke survivors and their carers in great danger of falling into that stroke recovery black hole. We need a better way, and that better way must be driven by stroke survivors and their carers, not the controlling power of the medical profession or the political objectives of existing stroke organisations. So what we are proposing here is the creation of an entirely new organisation called the Stroke Recovery Centre that will clearly state what stroke survivors and their carers need and become the driving force behind the satisfaction of those needs. The mission of the Stroke Recovery Centre is to help stroke survivors and their carers living in Boroondara communities to rebuild their post-stroke lives following discharge from hospital. The target market for the Stroke Recovery Centre is all stroke survivors and their carers living in Boroondara, but with particular focus on stroke survivors and carers who are newly discharged from hospital and who can benefit from being mentored by other stroke survivors and carers who have lived experience of stroke recovery within the Boroondara community, and the non-clinical aspects of their psychosocial recovery rather than clinical aspects of their stroke-related deficits, and finally preparing them for reconnecting to their communities via their local stroke support groups. The Stroke Recovery Centre is not intended to compete in any way with local stroke support groups, but to create a bridge which facilitates the transition of stroke survivors and their carers from the clinical services that dominate the acute and subacute care they receive while in hospital to the non-clinical services that they will come to rely on following their discharge back into their communities. This mission statement must be reflected in the Stroke Recovery Centre's strategic plan that will be outlined during the remainder of this presentation. The Stroke Recovery Centre strategic plan must be supported by a number of other key plans, including a marketing plan which identifies the key stakeholders of the Stroke Recovery Centre and how it will address their evolving needs. An information management plan which details how the information needed by all key stakeholders will be collected, stored, managed and distributed. And a resources plan which details what funds, facilities and human resources the Stroke Recovery Centre will need to address the needs of its key stakeholders. These plans must lead to the development and implementation of a coherent and realistic Stroke Recovery Centre operational plan. Specifically, the strategic plan must clearly identify the actual and potential future strategic partners of the Stroke Recovery Centre. It must clearly state what the Stroke Recovery Centre needs from each of these strategic partners and what these strategic partners need from the Stroke Recovery Centre. Stroke survivors have traditionally been very poor at establishing and maintaining links to strategic partners other than their state or national stroke organisations. This passive approach to developing mutually beneficial arrangements with key stakeholders has meant that very little has changed in recent times, and both stroke survivors and their carers continue to get little support in their communities. There is no way that this should be allowed to continue. Stroke survivors and carers need to finally stand up and say, "This is what we want, and we are prepared to work with anyone who will help us achieve what we want." The strategic plan must become the framework within which this vision of the future of community-based stroke recovery is expressed and developed. This slide illustrates how the Stroke Recovery Centre can work with existing and potential future strategic partners to build on the work currently being done by the Life After Stroke project within St George's Hospital in Kew. This argues that the Stroke Recovery Centre is the logical organisation to carry on that work once the Life After Stroke pilot project is completed. So who are the existing and potential future strategic partners of the Stroke Recovery Centre? Potentially, there are many of these, and perhaps the most obvious are the stroke survivors and carers themselves, and existing stroke organisations, including the Boroondara Stroke Support Group, BrainLink, the Stroke Association Victoria, and the National Stroke Foundation. Then there are community service providers and primary healthcare providers. And then local hospitals, medical networks, community service organisations, community health centres, and government agencies. For example, St George's Hospital, the Rotary Club of Kew, Inner East Community Health, Boroondara Council, and the Victorian Stroke Clinical Network. Then there are philanthropic and charitable organisations, stroke research institutes, and training and education institutions. And finally, the general public.